Hey, I'm Riley, this is Vibe Killer, and I'm here to hype up Stephen King's 5 most slept on books. But before we get into it, let's talk a little bit about the man himself. Hailed by many as the king of horror, and snubbed by many others as a self-indulgent writer of schlock, Stephen King is one of the most popular and best-selling authors of the last century. He's written 65 novels, more than 200 short stories, and as of the making of this video, he sold 350 million books worldwide, which is an insane number of books. Though he's best known for writing horror stories, his work spans multiple genres and includes science fiction, fantasy, pulp crime, literary fiction, memoir, and even a comic book, albeit a horror comic book. He also wrote and directed a movie once, a very campy mess of a movie called Maximum Overdrive, which he adapted from one of his own short stories called Trucks. And then he went right back to writing.
You monkhead!
In addition to a single directorial effort, over the years, King's stories have been adapted into a staggering number of movies, TV shows, and television miniseries. Some of them great.
Misery Spirit is still alive.
I don't want her back! I want her! Please!
Give me the bag.
Creepy Carrie! Creepy Carrie!
Some of them not so great.
Too late, Rose.
Too late, bro.
Kiss me, fat boy!
And some of them hilarious time capsules of mid-90s made-for-TV CGI.
Away from you.
So how could I claim that the books of somebody so incredibly famous and so celebrated could even be considered underrated? Well, it's because he's written so many books that when new readers come to King, they just read the most popular ones, and so some of his most interesting books have kind of slipped through the cracks and don't get read much today at all. And those are the books I'm covering today. So here are the 5 most underrated Stephen King books of all time. Due to its outlandish plot, Christine is a very well-known and very memed-on book, but it's also a really underread and underappreciated novel. At first blush, the premise is extremely silly. A boy buys a haunted, almost demonic car that can drive by itself and kill people, and he loves the car so much that he warps his entire life around it. As I'm saying this out loud, even though I know and love the book, it sounds f***ing stupid. And in the hands of a lesser writer, this novel would be a train wreck. But Stephen King's a good writer, so he uses the haunted cars like a Trojan horse to tell like a coming-of-age story about friendship and young romance and the harmful side effects of toxic nostalgia. That said, at its core, it's still a book about a killer car that can honk its own horn.
And then, honk honk! The car honked its own horn.
And even that aspect of the book is way better than it deserves to be, because King's a really good writer when it comes to the supernatural, and he makes the haunted car seem not only reasonable, but actually scary. I've never seen a book be so stupid and so smart at the same time, and for that reason alone, more people should read Christine. Rose Madder is probably Stephen King's most slept-on great book, largely because it got a lot of bad press when it first came out. King definitely has a few bad books, but Rose Madder isn't one of them. It was just misunderstood at release, and has been overlooked ever since by new readers because of its reputation with longtime fans. The book is about a 30-something woman named Rose who escapes her physically abusive marriage by running off one morning after her husband goes to work and catching a bus going 800 miles west. Once free of her husband, Rose begins a new life in the city with the help of a women's shelter, ready to put the past behind her and become her own woman. But unfortunately, the husband she left is a cop, a psychopathic murderer cop at that, who likes to kill and absolutely loves to bite. It's like a weird psychosexual thing for him. And he's using every resource and every cop instinct he has to track her down and kill her for leaving him. Her only hope of escaping this man is the strength she seems to pull from a painting she bought in a pawn shop. A very peculiar painting called Rose Madder that seems to change every time she looks at it. This book didn't sell well when it first came out, It was even mentioned by Stephen King in the sixth Dark Tower book as not catching on with readers. And that's because it came at an interesting time in his career, a period where he was losing a lot of longtime fans. Starting in 1992 with Gerald's Game and Dolores Claiborne, followed by Insomnia in 94, and ending with Rose Madder in 1995, King wrote 4 books in a row in which abusive men, either violent towards their wives, their daughters, or both, were the center of the stories. And by the time Rose Madder came out, a lot of his longtime readers were just over it. At first glance, I can see how this book just seems like more of the same. But when considered on its own merits, I think Rose Madder is a fantastic novel. One that explores cycles of abuse and domestic horror in a way that he never quite matches in those other titles. That said, it's not just Rose Madder. I think most of the books from that period are underrated, especially Gerald's Game, which is going to get an honorable mention right here. But if you read only one of these, check out Rose Madder. Cycle of the Werewolf is technically a novella, but it was released as a standalone instead of in a collection like most of his other mid-length work, stories like The Mist or Life of Chuck, and so we're going to count it here. The story is about the arrival of a werewolf in a small New England town, and how every month on the night of the full moon, this ungodly creature tears into a new set of victims. Most of the townsfolk believe that these grisly killings are being carried out by a deranged man, but one wheelchair-bound young boy has seen the wolf up close and is determined to find out the beast's true identity and stop this reign of terror. This book is very short and very pulpy, and a lot of people shrug it off as being sort of goofy, especially when compared to his other work. It's gotten a lot of criticism because Stephen King doesn't follow the lunar calendar at all and moves the full moon around to line up with holidays to maximize the irony. The most common criticism I've heard of Cycle of the Werewolf is that it lacks the deep character building most associated with King's work. And while that's true, I think the focus on plot over character benefits this particular story, because it allows the focus to remain on the werewolf and all of the violence that it commits over the course of a calendar year. As silly as elements of the book may be, I think how fast and fun it is overshadows any of its flaws. And if you find the right additions, it even has these beautiful full-color illustrations and minimal sketches to help sell the story. Definitely worth having in your collection. In the number 2 spot, we have The Dark Tower 2, Drawing of the Three, and it's not so much underrated as it is criminally underread. The people who've read this book tend to love it, but very few people have given it a chance. Years after the events of the first book, yet simultaneously immediately after that story due to the bizarre sorcery of the Man in Black, Roland the Gunslinger finds himself lost, wounded, and sick on a dangerous beach. There he begins a long adventure in and out of his homeworld as he travels from his universe to our very own New York City, where he tries to assemble a team of people he's never met, but people he will need to achieve his goal to reach the Dark Tower. Now, if you haven't read the first Dark Tower book, The Gunslinger, that probably sounds like gibberish. And even if you have, if you didn't go on with the series, I bet it doesn't sound very interesting, which is how this book ended up number 2 on our list of most underrated. The Gunslinger is one of Stephen King's top-selling books, but there's a huge drop-off to the second novel as far as number of sales. Which is such a shame, because the second novel is the first book that gives the Dark Tower series emotional weight and a real sense of consequence. The first book in the series is a weird gothic western, punctuated with demons, zombie mutants, a wizard, and a somewhat unlikable gunslinger with seemingly unearned powers of superhuman strength and accuracy. If that sounds like a miss, it's because it kind of is, and a lot of people give up on the Dark Tower series completely after reading it, worried that all 7 books will be more of the same. But Book 2 introduces several likable, easy-to-invest-in characters, and begins a long process of showing us why the main character, Roland the Gunslinger, is the way he is. Starting with Drawing of the Three, and then continuing with each book that follows, the original Dark Tower novel actually gets better in retrospect, because it sets up a narrative and a character almost as a misdirect, and then over the next 30 years, as the series continues, we get to see what was actually going on in those early pages, and why it matters. If you've only read The Gunslinger, you owe it to yourself to read Drawing of the Three, and in my opinion, the rest of the series. In the top spot of this list, we have 2 books, which is kind of cheating, but kind of isn't. And those books are Desperation, written by Stephen King, and The Regulators, written by Richard Bachman, Stephen King's pseudonym. But to explain why these books are so underrated, first I have to tell you about how awful the 90s were for Stephen King. Starting with the third Dark Tower book, The Wastelands, in 91, that ends in a cliffhanger, and then followed that same year by the often slighted Needful Things, and then followed by a string of books about violent men, Stephen King was losing a lot of fans. Also during this time, a bunch of bad movies and made-for-television miniseries were being made from his works, like the underwhelming Children of the Corn series and the absolutely dreadful Langoliers. Even though the low quality of these projects were usually the fault of small budgets, bad acting, and bad screenplay adaptations, in the 90s more than any other decade, Stephen King became strongly associated with schlock horror and bad writing. In 96, Stephen King released The Green Mile as a series of 6 novelettes, each one telling the next 80 pages or so of the story. Although the novel was a critical success, the way it was sold certainly was not, because the books came out weeks apart, leaving the readers constantly unsatisfied. And to add to that, each volume was $2.99, meaning the whole story was $19, when the average paperback at the time was $6. 1996 was also the year that Desperation and the Regulators came out, and with one of the books being written as Bachman, and with the mirrored elements from novel to novel, a lot of people wrote Stephen King off that year, pointing to the release of these paired novels and the 6 novelettes of The Green Mile, and saying that he was out of good stories and was relying on gimmicks alone to get attention. I think it's because so many early fans left Stephen King behind in the 90s that people think the work from this period is bad, when honestly he wrote some of his best books at that time, and none are more harshly overlooked than Desperation and The Regulators. The 2 books are parallels of each other and take place in different timelines and different universes. Desperation is about a small-town sheriff who starts kidnapping people off the highway and then holds them hostage while he kills them off one by one. The Regulators is about an autistic child who suddenly becomes super powerful and starts manipulating the world around him with his thoughts alone. And at the core of both books is an evil spirit named Tok, who comes from deep below the desert soil, and is related to the monster from It, otherwise known as Pennywise the Clown. Which is kind of weird, but weirder still is the fact that these books take place in parallel universes, with characters from one book showing up in the other, but in different forms. Stephen King said he got the ideas for the book thinking about playhouse companies, and the way that they'll do one play one night, and then the same cast will do another play the next night. He thought, can I write 2 books like that, with characters from one showing up in the other? And the way he figured out how to do it was to use his real name and his pseudonym, using parallel universes and the Dark Tower to tie it all together. What an incredible undertaking. And even more incredible, he finished them one day apart. Desperation one day, The Regulators the next, having written them concurrently. Some people like Desperation more than they like The Regulators, which kind of makes sense because they're very different books, but at the same time they're kind of the same book, kind of like how Kill Bill Volume 1 and Kill Bill Volume 2 are 2 movies, but they're the same movie. In my opinion, you can't separate the 2 films, and I feel the same way about these books. That concludes our top 5 most underrated Stephen King books of all time. I'd love to hear if you agree with me on how underrated these books are, or if you think I'm overhyping mid-level novels. And if you think there's a Stephen King book I've overlooked and deserves to be on this list, let's talk about it in the comments. If you like the show, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Vibe Killer.